There are events going on in Belfast as we speak, so we're going to catch up on that. But today we're obviously discussing the horrific attack that happened there, the violence that's been going on since. We're going to talk about how this Sudanese asylum seeker got from Paris to Dublin, from Dublin to Belfast. We're going to talk about asylum and illegal immigration more broadly and the various parties' different plans. How realistic are they? How would they be implemented? But first, Robert, your thought.
So look, this plays into one of the big political themes of the moment, which is concern about asylum seekers and whether there are appropriate controls in place. And so, there are two enormous issues we have to discuss. One is why we are again seeing horrible violence, criminal violence on the streets of this country. And the second issue is how and whether any government can restore confidence that the immigration rules, and particularly when it comes to what people talk of as unauthorised immigration, whether they are appropriate for these times. So huge issues.
Let's talk about that in a minute. But first, let's try and establish what is actually going on in Belfast. Stewart, Robson, who is our Northern Ireland reporter, has been in court this morning and is, as you can see, if you're watching this, standing outside. The defendant has just appeared in court. Stewart, talk us through what you've seen this morning, what happened.
Yeah, Tom, look, this is not long out of court, as you say, and this is the main court in Belfast. Now, the defendant didn't actually appear here in person. He is being held in the serious crime suite of a police station not too far away from here. That is basically a police station where some of the most serious alleged offenders are held when they're not required to appear in court in person. Now, sitting in a room at that police station alongside officers was a man called Hadi Al-Odeid. Now, he's the 30-year-old Sudanese man who you just referenced there. He has been charged with attempting to murder a man in North Belfast on Monday evening. Now, such is the media attention around this. It's not the biggest courtroom, but the press benches were completely full. Other journalists had to go into the public gallery, which was already full with members of the public wanting to witness this first hearing today. But what it did allow us to do is to get a bit of a sense of the enormity, I suppose, of this, the gravity of this situation, because as you've referenced, that event on Monday night has then spilled out into other violence as well on the streets that we saw last night. Now, interestingly, some of the other charges that he is facing are possession of a bladed weapon, but also making threats to kill. And quite unusually this morning, the court service here revealed that those threats to kill were actually allegedly directed at an NHS radiographer. Now, where exactly those alleged threats were made, it wasn't disclosed, so we're not too sure on those exact details. Now, we also heard that he has no settled employment status here in Northern Ireland and that the chances of reoffending is likely. So he was remanded in custody until 4 weeks' time.
Stuart, we obviously have to be very careful because these are live proceedings and we have to be very mindful of contempt of court. But from what you're saying, what has emerged this morning is that there appear to have been threats to an NHS radiographer which we were not aware of, or alleged threats. And then we've got no real idea whether there's any relationship between those alleged threats and the alleged attack that took place. Do we know any more that fills in the gaps? Do we know who the victim was?
Yeah, so those further details were released in court about the victim. In fact, his name was also mentioned. He's called Stephen Ogilvie, and the detective inspector also made the court aware that he still remains in the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast in a serious condition. What was also revealed was more about the injuries that he sustained in the attack. So they are gravely serious. He has lost his left eye. He has had his right eye severely damaged, and he also suffered further lacerations to his face, neck, and back.
Was there anything revealed in court in relation to possible motive?
There wasn't actually anything said about motive, Robert. That's something we've been trying to uncover just over the last few days.
But there's not been any suggestion, has there been, that this is in some sense a terror incident?
No, certainly not. And the Chief Constable yesterday, the Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, John Boucher, came out quite emphatically yesterday to say that there is no terrorist motivation at this stage. And he was keen to point that out at this stage. I think what's important, I suppose, to keep in mind here is that police are still trying to uncover a lot of the details about what specifically happened at the location in North Belfast on Monday and what specifically led to what happened as well.
Stewart, it's obviously been a very violent night on the streets of Belfast. You were out and about. What did you see?
Yeah, well, Tom, this all really started from when we were looking from the offices, the ITV offices here in Belfast. We have the luxury of being able to see right across the city, and really at around 8 o'clock I started to notice smoke billowing from the east of the city. So myself and the camera operator and our team headed towards that direction, and when we got there we came across large groups of people at the bottom of one of the main roads that leads into the city, and at the further end of the road was public transport alight. It was quite a long bus that was completely gutted and was actually exploding at times, which really just shows the danger that people who were deciding to be there last night were putting themselves in. There was actually some people we witnessed, even when the fire service was trying to put it out, by putting more fuel on the bus to try and keep that going. So there was real determination from some people last night in quite a volatile situation to really make it as dangerous as possible. Now, it wasn't only just that bus that was on fire. We noticed homes then start to come under attack later in the night. Other colleagues were out and were able to capture some families actually being evacuated from their streets close to where this bus was being burnt. There was one striking picture I actually saw this morning of a family being bundled into a police Land Rover as their home was attacked. So this wasn't just people setting fire to things with people not in them. This was obviously intimidation of trying to get people out of homes and trying to create that fear, I suppose, in communities. So that was in the east of the city. We then travelled to the north of the city where roads were being blocked. And one thing I noticed last night as well is that when we got to the north of the city at a main interchange between a road that leads to the south and one that leads to the north, there was actually people blocking both intersections with blue bins. And at that point, there was one police car with two police officers. And I actually got chatting to one of the officers, and he said that basically we feel helpless here. We are depleted in numbers. If we were to go and try and stop any of this violence happening, if we were going to try and let any of those cars through, the numbers of people there carrying out those acts is far superior to any of the police on the ground. So that really just shows how stretched police are here at the minute. And I think also shows that there's a real fear if there is any more violence here, how the police then respond to that. And we do know this afternoon that there have been calls for further protests. Political leaders here have, of course, called for calm. We've got an updated statement from the victim's family of Monday's stabbing, also calling for calm. And of course, police as well, hoping that none of the violence that we saw last night plays out later today.
The violent scenes that we've seen overnight, they have happened in largely Protestant areas. Is that significant?
I think so. It's these areas where it has happened have not been, say, averse to trouble, I suppose, in the past. I think what we can say is that what a lot of communities here may be feeling is a lot of what we're hearing maybe across the water in England, maybe with the rise of reform, and I suppose they're finding attachment with that. And I think a lot of what has been said from maybe political parties here, from unionist tradition, is aligning with those views about concerns around immigration. But of course, what was called for yesterday throughout most of the day was for there to be no violence and for any planned protests last night to remain calm. But as we know, in different parts of the city, in the east of the city, which you said is, as you referenced, is mainly Protestant areas. But even further into the city, in the northern parts, violence and trouble also erupted. We stood on the Newton Arch Road, one of the main thoroughfares in Belfast in the east of the city last night, which leads into the city centre. And we saw fire engines try to get to a bus that was on fire. They were in negotiations with police about whether it was actually safe to move from where they were to head towards where the bus was on fire. Such was the significance of the amount of people that were there. They were worried about their own safety. So that really gives you a bit of a flavour of how serious and volatile that situation was last night.
And one of the things I've been struck by, I mean, there have been photos online of peaceful protests, and there have been quite a lot of peaceful protests along with the violence. And I was quite interested that on those peaceful protests there were Republic of Ireland flags as well as Union flags. So it's plainly the concern about asylum seekers crossing the border is plainly not essentially restricted to the Protestant community.
No, I think that would be fair to say. And I mean, we've seen protests even across the border in Dublin surrounding immigration just over the last year or so. So there almost seems to be what they would maybe describe as a collective concern. And as someone that's lived in Northern Ireland all my life, and even the generations before me, to see those two flags side by side in some sort of what they would term maybe a joint cause or joint beliefs, it's incredibly unusual. But that, I suppose, shows how wide the feeling is surrounding immigration, perhaps on both sides of the border, but also in different communities in Northern Ireland as well.
Stewart, one final very brief point, just because I think people will want to understand that. There are obviously no border checks between the Republic and the North, and anyone who's ever been there will know that even if you put them on, they'd be hopeless. It's an enormous, border as the security forces found to their cost during the Troubles. Theoretically, as I understand it, if you get on a ferry from Belfast to the rest of the UK, you have to have ID, though there is no, that's more of a theory than in practice. There's no actual requirement for that ID to be checked. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I suppose it changes from time to time, to be honest, Tom. I mean, there's flights that I've got on when travelling to Liverpool or London, and some flight companies haven't even checked ID as well. So that seems to be a bit of a fluid situation. But certainly when you're travelling from either side of the border, if you're travelling by car, you won't be checked unless there is a random search from Gardaí across the border when you enter into the Republic of Ireland if you're travelling south. But certainly if I've been on buses or trains, there are no real checks. It seems to be quite a free-flowing passage, I suppose, if you are wanting to travel from either side of the border. So I think that would be accurate to try and describe it as that.
Stewart, thank you very much. That was fantastically useful. Thank you. Robert, the police said this man flew from Paris to Dublin, but that's illegal. You shouldn't be able to do that, right?
Well, he shouldn't be able to do that unless he had valid travel documents. If he arrives in the EU as an asylum seeker and he's in Paris, then it is the French authorities who should be processing his asylum claim. And any airline should have refused to carry him from Paris to Dublin for the simple reason that the Republic of Ireland is not in the Schengen Agreement. Now, it is very, very difficult to stop asylum seekers moving around for those countries that are effectively borderless within the EU. So, there is no border between France and Italy, for example. So it would have been impossible to stop him going to Italy if he'd wanted to. It is odd. It does feel, there's obviously our questions to answer about how he got to Dublin. But once he's in Dublin, at that point, it's very easy for this individual or any asylum seeker, once they're in the Republic, to get into Northern Ireland, because the British government does not, on the whole, carry out any checks on people crossing that border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Now, very interestingly, I was talking to a unionist politician just this morning who said actually the Republic of Ireland, because they have their own concerns about asylum seekers, is, I don't know whether it's systematic or random, but they do institute checks on people crossing from, I don't think they can be systematic, but they do institute some checks on people crossing from Northern Ireland into the Republic. And this politicians were saying the British government should do the same. Now, this is obviously going to be a hot potato, and we'll just wait and see, whether any of these rules do change. Because, of course, the open border is absolutely fundamental to the Good Friday Agreement and to essentially stability and peace, between the Republic and Northern Ireland. It's a hugely sensitive, contentious issue.
I guess the question we should address is that a lot of people listening to this or watching this will probably think, and many of them, not necessarily conservatives, a lot of them quite liberal, why can we not stop so many illegal migrants coming to this country? I mean, the truth of it is that the government has done a pretty good job of bringing down legal migration, up from, down from nearly 1 million to 170,000 last year. That's a big drop. We've talked many times before about how it's quite difficult to keep our economy moving without a certain level of legal migration. But pretty much everyone has agreed that illegal migration is really, really difficult, problematic, makes lots of people very angry. And of course, that anger really spills over when it turns out that one of these people who's come here seeking sanctuary then commits a crime. There are lots of people who aren't here seeking asylum committing crime, but that's kind of not the point. It's the fact that they're here seeking sanctuary from us and then committing a crime that so winds people up. Reform, and indeed the Tories, do have very radical plans. Reform say they're going to, if they get in, review all asylum claims for the last 5 years and deport people to an overseas territory, immediately. I mean, what do you make of this issue more broadly and the various plans to solve it? Because it's one of those things that a lot of people start from, this is an intolerable problem, we must solve it, we're capable of solving it, we should solve it. But then when you get into the actual details, and it's not even just the European Convention on Human Rights, because yes, we could pull out of that, but we're still a signatory to the Convention on Refugees, for example, it is very, very hard. And if it wasn't hard, people would have done it already. What do you make of it when you look at this issue?
So look, the first thing to say, you asked a very simple question, why are so many people coming here? It's because, in parts of the world, like Sudan, where this guy came from, conditions are absolutely desperate. And, people are risking their lives when they cross the channel. This guy did not risk his life by crossing the channel. But nonetheless, he comes from a country where life is pretty desperate. It's not surprising that he, wants to go somewhere like the UK where he feels life will be better. And, and it is just when there is that kind of, in a sense, push factor from parts of the world that are absolutely struggling. Every country in Europe is got the same problem. Of seeing, all sorts of people arriving uninvited. Now, the question is, why are so many communities so unbelievably upset about this? Why, when you see violence of this sort, is that then a trigger for the most appalling criminal behaviour, which we've seen overnight? Burning of a bus, we heard about, burning of houses, targeting of law-abiding black families in Belfast. I mean, this is horrifying criminal behaviour, but it is symptomatic of wider concerns about immigration. And as again, just talking to people on the ground in Northern Ireland last night and this morning, the concerns are the ones that one has been hearing for years in Britain, which is a concern about people's communities changing without the longer sort of those who've been in those communities for longer being asked whether they wanted their communities to change. And I would always argue that, again, linked to all of this is, it's not just the composition of the community that troubles people. It is access to public services. It is job prospects. Concern about immigration is overlaid on, deeper concerns about the fact that people's living standards haven't risen for years and years. There was an absolutely brilliant piece done overnight by our colleague Lewis Dennison about how many white working class young men, boys in the northeast are suffering from, in some cases, acute mental health issues, can't get jobs, are failed by their schools, fail in schools. Disproportionately, the life prospects now of young white working class men in the northeast worse than pretty much any other part of our community. And that loss of hope then often feeds into all sorts of toxic attitudes.
Can I just jump?
And so this is a multifaceted problem, and so there are, for example, now politicians on the far right, like Rupert Lowe for the Restore Britain party, getting an enormous amount of attention. I mean, he did a post overnight, talking about, how Restore would expel, he says, millions of people from Britain as the solution. Those sorts of extraordinary, you would argue by British standards, policy pledges are getting enormous amounts of traction. I suppose
that you make a whole load of interesting points there, and I guess one of my comebacks would be that we're talking about two kind of, in one sense, is different things. You just outlined very clearly the issues that people face about changing communities, the level of migration generally, the sense of pressure on public services. As we've discussed many times on this podcast before, we haven't built anything like enough houses over the last 20 years, in fact, longer than that. All these things mean that when people feel they're getting too much immigration, they feel angry about that because they feel like their own life chances are being impacted. In one sense, that is quite easy to solve. You can build more houses, you can create more GP surgeries, you can build more schools, and you can turn down illegal migration. And indeed, this government is already doing that, and you can reduce it to zero if you really want, although, as we've discussed, that has consequences for the economy. In a way, what's going on in Belfast this week may be somewhat about that, but it's also about the other issue that we talked about, which is the one I think that really gets into people's heads, which is why can't we stop? And I think it doesn't help that a lot of them are sort of undocumented young men, not all of them by any stretch of the imagination, but quite a lot of them are, and that repeatedly features in the kind of reform and restore rhetoric. But we just can't seem to do anything about it. Now, Reform and Restore and even the Tories are promising quite radical action. But every time I look into it, it just seems incredibly... I mean, Trump came in with masses of bellicose rhetoric about their own issues over there. And as we've seen, ICE have found it... I mean, they may have gone about it completely the wrong way.
Well, they have closed the border. Let's be absolutely clear.
They have closed the border. But in terms of getting rid of illegal migrants... they've really struggled. And the last time I looked, Donald Trump wasn't deporting significantly more people than Joe Biden had. But because it's really, really hard. And people throw out these kind of slogans like, we'll deport millions of people. Well, how?
So look, plainly, pledging to expel very large numbers of people will appeal, I think, probably to a minority of British people, although I would argue that almost certainly a majority of British people would want fewer people and in many cases risking their lives coming in without permission. And that is, I mean, this is not, me doing, anything other than looking at the facts. This is not in any sense me saying, yippee for Donald Trump. But Donald Trump has, achieved a remarkable thing on the border with Mexico. Okay, I mean, many, many fewer people are crossing that border. We have not succeeded in this country in significantly, or in terms of what the British people would expect, reducing the numbers crossing the Channel enough, or indeed, in this context, crossing, through the common travel area between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And it is, when you've just got the weight of, as I say, of desperate people trying to get here, it is, I'm not trying, this is not an excuse, right? I think any government that succeeded in doing that would get quite a big political windfall. I think probably more of a windfall than simply expelling people. I suspect actually any government that did expel people might lose quite a lot of British support, because many people would say that's not the British way if these people have made a home here. But if I had the answer to how you do that effectively, presumably people would carry me shoulder high into Downing Street, but I don't, because the truth is, for all sorts of humanitarian, policing, practical issues, it is just very, very hard. We're not a country that's going to basically put the armed forces on our border and shoot people as they attempt to come here. And absent that, you've got to ask yourself, what on earth can we do? There are interesting questions about, if we hadn't left the EU, would we have the kind of better relationship with France that would mean that we would have, better, more cooperative policing on the beaches of France itself? Don't know. I just don't know how much damage was done to that relationship. Certainly since we left the EU, the numbers crossing, and this could be correlation rather than causation, but the numbers crossing via the Channel have gone up significantly since we left the EU.
I don't want people listening to this podcast who may be frustrated by it or watching it to feel like, we're making excuses for inaction in any way. But, I've spent one spends a lot of time thinking about it because it's so frequently in the news. And, I've been doing news at 10, 11 years now, which means you've been political editor for 11 years. And you'll remember in the very, very early days, do you remember I think it must have been the first 6 months when all those refugees were pouring out of Syria and literally walking in their hundreds of thousands across Europe. Those scenes are quite extraordinary. And 11 years later, Europe is still not on the same scale, admittedly, but grappling with essentially the same problems. Even if you adopted the more extreme policies, or the more radical, one should say, policies of some people who want to take tough action, it's like, okay, but how are you going to get people? Where are you going to place them? How are you going to deport them? Where are you going to deport them to? I mean, you can't take them to nowhere. They've either got to go back, even if you massively strip out the legislation that prevents it. Where are you going to send them to? Their home countries? It's very, very hard. And whilst I don't want to make excuses for various governments in their inactions, I think we all appreciate people's frustration with it. And, it's our job to scrutinise the potential solutions to this problem, because we identify that people, are very angry about it. But it's really, really difficult. I think that would be my takeaway.
It is very difficult. I'm going to boil it down now to three very simple things that need to be done, which are definitely easier said than done. One is, if people are coming here without permission, I think it is perfectly reasonable to, expedite their processing as quickly as possible, to ascertain whether there is a genuine humanitarian ground to grant them asylum. I don't think that process is still not rapid enough. When you get the kind of protests that we've seen last night that are violent, that lead to the destruction of property, then the full force of the law has to be deployed against those people. But I don't want to sound like I'm making excuses for any kind of criminal behaviour. But underlying all of this is, frankly, a succession of governments and an economy that has failed over 15 or longer years. Underlying all of this is a sense among people who live here that life is not getting better for them because the economy is not working for them. Public services are squeezed. There's not enough housing. And one of the reasons why you get these incredible, horrible, violent criminal flashpoints, when you see the kind of atrocity that was committed in Belfast, is because it comes against a backdrop where too many people in this country just feel that the state government fails them. And, this is about frustrations built up over many, many, many years. And at the end of the day, you have to address the symptom, and you address the symptom with the full force of the law, but you also have to address the cause, right? And the cause, fundamentally, is effectively about an economy that is not serving the vast majority of people in the way that it should. And one of the reasons this government is in so much trouble is because it promised to make the changes that would give people back hope, and it has singularly failed to do that.
Okay, well, are we going to get a new government soon? We'll see. We got the Makerfield by-election coming out. We'll be talking about all that, but for now, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.